Okay, folks, welcome to the 30-minute method. Tonduk University, Faculty of Social Science and Humanities. We're really happy today to have Ken Fero speak with us. He's zoomed in from London. He's the director of some award-winning films that, if you haven't heard about, you should find out about. Injustice, especially from 1999, and just recently, Ultraviolence, which is doing really well. There's some other films as well. You can see his work on migrant media. There's a migrant media website and so on. He teaches at Regent's University, a film course, filmmaking course, and at Coventry. And he has also been an advisor to us here in TDTU of plans to make a BA media sociology. So we're happy to have you back, Ken, to talk again. He's also spoken to my class once as well. I was just telling the students about that today. And today he'll talk for about 20-25 minutes at the most, and then we'll have a bit of discussion, and that's it. Short and sweet. Yeah, Ken, over to you.
So you should be able to see this. Okay. Despite that shaky start, I'm actually quite supposed to be quite an expert in media. But what I wanted to talk about today is the notion of obstinate memory. So just to explain a little bit about my background, I'm a documentary filmmaker and a political activist as well. And I don't really separate the two. I'm part of a collective because I think collective working is very important as opposed to individualized perspectives. So for the past 30 years, actually longer than 30 years, together with migrant media, I've been making films around human rights abuses in Europe and how the victims and the families of the victims try to get justice for these abuses. And in making these films, quite recently, I've been exploring and trying to put this notion across of obstinate memory. Now, obstinate memory is something which is very relevant to the area that I'm working with in terms of trauma. Now, in terms of some of the documentaries that John has mentioned, for example, these films are around the trauma as experienced by the families who are on the receiving end of state violence, racial violence in this case. But the notion of obstinate memory is something that can be applied to any situation. There's a quote here by Wim Wenders, who's a filmmaker, who talks about how it's impossible for people to have hope because the nature of mass media and television makes sure that there is no hope for them. So the message that the mass media is making all the time is that things are bad, things can't improve, things can only get worse. And this is a very negative attitude. And the notion of obstinate memory is something that tries to fight against that by not just talking about the trauma that's been experienced, which is very real, but also talking about resistance, the resistance to the state violence that's been experienced in the UK context, in the European context, and of course, in many other contexts as well. So one of the important things to establish is how obstinate memory works against the dominant media. Peter Watkins, who's a filmmaker and also a theorist, is British, now lives in Lithuania, and came up with the notion of the mass audiovisual media. And I would recommend, if you don't know it already, that you go to his website and read up about his position. What Watkins has done in terms of his filmmaking and his theory, he's a documentary filmmaker, is talked about and explained how he sees the monoform. Now, the monoform, from his point of view, is the mass audiovisual media, which obviously includes dominant cinemas like Hollywood, Bollywood, all the other woods, and also national televisions. The idea of Watkins is that media is a system of audience control, which we can see, and we can see how that functions in many states, as opposed to the possibilities of a more interactive approach. Now, what he means by that, and by the idea of the monoform, is that most of us watch cinema, we watch television, and these films have a narrative. The narrative is established by the filmmaker. The filmmaker wants you to think something or feel something at the end of the film, whether that's an advert or whether it's a feature film or whatever. And what Watkins is proposing is that there are other forms of filmmaking which are more inclusive and allow for the audience to have more of a thought process involved. This is really to do with very basic things like editing, like space, like rhythm. And if you look at the work of Watkins, and to a certain extent, quite a lot of cinema from the global south, quite a lot of independent filmmaking, the possibilities of audience to actually think and put their own thoughts, their own politics, their own experiences into the film are what Watkins is proposing. And the notion of obstinate memory follows that proposal in a sense, because what it's doing is asking the audience and telling the audience that really the filmmaker has the ability to time travel. Filmmakers are able to stop and film and produce work when the rest of the people are going about their daily business. It's a responsibility of filmmakers to document what's happening, in a sense, to stop time and to show their country, their people, what is going on around them. So it's a very big responsibility. This is Watkins. I won't play it, but the slides are available for John, but that's a very short clip of him explaining his process. And what he's talking is about, there's a linear way of working, which is television, which is you start at the beginning, you get to the end. And of course, film is linear. You can't stop it and move away. But within the linear space, within the time within a film, there are decisions that are made about what the audience are able to feel. Now, his experience, Watkins' experience of this came in 1965 with a film that was commissioned by the BBC, by BBC Television, and it was meant to be broadcast in 1966 on the Hiroshima anniversary. Now, what Watkins did with that film is that he used this notion of audience intervention in making this movie. The movie was very, very disturbing. It didn't use actors, it used real people, it used real government documents to paint a scenario of what would happen if nuclear war began. This was at the time of the Cold War, obviously, between US and USSR, and Britain's position was obviously pro-US. And Watkins was trying to explain to people by taking government documents in terms of what would happen, what are you supposed to do when a bomb falls? And in the UK, there were lots of propaganda films made about the best way to avoid being harmed by an atomic bomb is to run underneath the table and cover your head with your hands. And so this was the propaganda of the British state, which was based on fear and exploiting fear for their political gain. And Watkins, by taking all the government manuals on what would happen, what was the scenario, because there were lots of government documents which were written by the government and prepared to let people know what would they have to do if there was a nuclear bomb. And so there were civil emergencies and military emergency plans. And he got hold of all of these and he reenacted them. And the effect of the film was absolutely shocking. And the BBC decided they wouldn't show the film. So they banned the film from 1966 to 1985. Now, despite the banning of the BBC, Watkins won an Oscar for his documentary in 1966. And so Watkins' experience of that was very clear, was that if you start to question the state and find other ways of making films which are inclusive, then you're going to be silenced. And so that's why he went to Lithuania. Watkins went on to make several films, one called La Commune, which I think is about 7 hours, about the Paris Commune. And I would really urge and recommend people to watch his work. And what Watkins does in terms of obstinate memory is to interrupt history. So he would make a film, for example, about Culloden, which was a battle between the English and the Scots. And instead of it being a period costume drama, which it was, he would then have TV crews coming to interrupt the action and say, well, what happens next and what's going to happen next? And by doing that, he's interrupting, mainstream media. Free Palestine. So jumping from the Cold War to recently, of course, mass audiovisual media, the MONOFORM, as Watkins outlines it, is already being interrupted and undermined by social media. And of course, one of the biggest arms we've had yesterday in the movement for Free Palestine, where we had 8.4 billion hits on Free Palestine. Now, some people may say, well, this is transitory, it doesn't make any difference. But you can see by the political contents of the Free Palestine movement, the whole debate around Israel and Palestine has been influenced by it. This is just one of the pages from the TikTok. And so obstinate memory relates to this very strongly. If people know anything about the Palestinian struggle, one of the slogans from the 1960s onwards was from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. And this is something that was chanted last year in demonstrations across the world. That became a very important political call, which really, from the point of view of the youth, was something which they absolutely began to believe in. So young people, through obstinate memory, are rejecting the politics of the 20th century, in a sense. Young people have rejected the idea of the Oslo Accord, which was the agreement between Israel and Palestine. And so obstinate memory plays a part even in social media. Apart from Watkins, who is a theorist and a filmmaker, the other person that's worth looking at is Patricio Guzman, who has made a series of films about Pinochet, about the military junta in Chile. And Guzman is very clear about his position, that he sees film and documentary as an archive of human history. But and he has made some great films. The problem with this is that if you try to explore the idea of obstinate memory, you begin to question whether documentary actually does function in that way at all, whether documentary and film can make any difference. And so what he calls the great archive of human history is problematic in this sense. Many people will be familiar with these images of Vietnam. These images that were broadcast across the world did not prevent the use of phosphorus in Fallujah by the US Army in the early 2000s. So clearly, even where imagery exists, powerful imagery exists as obstinate memory, it doesn't have the impact that some of us may wish that it had, in that it doesn't prevent further injustices and further crimes. So back to the work that we do in terms of migrant media, we believe that race and class are the core of our resistance-based work. And one of the most important influences on us is Third Cinema. And Third Cinema, which I mentioned before about film from the Global South, was very important in that it tried to break the MONOFORM, the dominant media process, which was basically middle-class bourgeois individuals make films, they dominate the industry, they represent their class, this is the work that goes out. Third Cinema was trying to incite political change through the process of making the film, the process of showing the film, and the process of changing the film as they went along. So they would shoot some film, go and show it to the people, get the response, and then add to it and build on and on. And of course, this is itself based on the Soviet agitprop trains from the that went ahead during the Russian Revolution, because everybody understood during the revolution that if you have a population that's completely illiterate in terms of reading text, everybody is literate in terms of imagery. Imagery is a form of language, and it's a very powerful form of language, and people understand images even if they can't read. So Gattino and Solanas were the people who have been credited really for Third Cinema when they wrote their manifesto for the Tricontinental, which was published in the 1960s. And this idea of Third Cinema, I think, is something which is becoming more popular today. And you can see with the movements of filmmakers from the global South, across Africa, across the Middle East, and across Asia, then this is becoming stronger and stronger. This is one of the films from Patricio Guzman I mentioned earlier, which basically documented what happened in Chile. And one of the interesting things with Chile and this whole notion of obstinate memory, and really to talk a little bit about where we are today in terms of COVID, for example, the COVID experience. Milton Friedman, who was a US economist, went down to Chicago in the 1950s and set up a group called the Chicago Boys. They were also studying at the same time CIA torture techniques. The CIA were trying to find out the best way of torturing people. And they realized that physical torture was not as powerful as psychological torture. And the most powerful form of psychological torture is isolation. And so he took that concept to Pinochet, who applied it to his people, and the repression of his people were based on Friedman's ideas, because Friedman believed in the free market. The leftist movement were becoming powerful in Chile, and he wanted to destroy it. So you can see how imagery and politics and movements of people are important to document. It's important to document because there's a history of resistance. And it's important to document because everybody has an obstinate memory. We all have an obstinate memory. There are things which we cannot forget and we will not forget. The question is, what do we do about them as a group of filmmakers or academics? How do we teach our students the notion of obstinate memory? And one way we can do it, of course, from the film point of view, is the notion of praxis. That is the combination of theory and practice. And praxis in the film making position is one of how to work collectively, how to ensure the practice is related to the experience of people, and also how to make the theory and practice have an impact. Now, the impact could be national, the impact could be a student wanting a higher grade, the impact could be somebody wanting to win a prize for their film. There are different kinds of impacts, and we all have to make a choice of what that is. But if you don't have theory and if you don't combine that with practice, then you're never going to place yourself in a position of historical development. And that's something that's very important for filmmakers. One of the things that around this idea of obstinate memory is the notion of a documentary of force. A documentary of force is something which we have developed, which migrant media have developed. And in a sense, it relates to this notion of obstinate memory, because a documentary of force will not allow things to be forgotten. If there have been national crimes, it's important that they are dealt with, and it's important that they are dealt with not because of just because of collective memory, but because we cannot have a society, or we cannot live in a country which refuses to accept its past. Because if we cannot accept our past, we cannot know where we want to go in the future. And so in terms of our work, we've done several films which are all available on Vimeo around different issues in the UK. I suppose the obstinate memory is the fact that after 30 years, we still haven't given up, despite everything that's happened to us. I won't go into a lot of detail in terms of what the result have been of our films, is just to say that we have in the UK been censored, we have been blacklisted, we have been whitewashed, we have been threatened physically, and this is all because we have an obstinate memory and nothing more. John mentioned Injustice. It was a 2001 film, which dealt with the idea that the families of people who were killed by the police in the UK have a collective memory and an obstinacy in terms of the fact that they want justice. All of these people you see were killed by the police. None of the police officers that killed these people were ever brought to justice. And these are just a few out of 2,000 we've had. And so with our obstinate memory, we went on, and we have done for the past 30 years, as I've mentioned, to try and make these films. Now, one of the other notions of obstinate memory comes from the Dziga-Vertov Group, which is about political filmmaking. And I think for us, we don't just believe in political film, but we make films politically. And making films politically is about how you work with people, how you work with a community, how you teach, how you educate. All of these things are about how we interact with each other and how that makes a difference in terms of the political content and the message of the film, which of course relates to the idea of Watkins, of the MONOFORM and how to break the MONOFORM. Yes, so basically the work that we do is about trauma. It's about documenting that trauma, about sharing the trauma, and about creating this notion of obstinate memory of the crimes of the state, which need to be dealt with by the state and which are demanded from the people. And we, of course, reject mass audiovisual media, the influences I've explained in terms of third cinema and Watkins and the global South filmmaking process from which we originate, because migrant media is basically a collective of people who come from outside the UK and who've come together with a political and a cultural program that we're trying to push forward. Our latest film is Ultraviolence, which is currently banned in the UK. If anyone wants to see it, please get in touch and we can have a discussion around it. And I think finally, I don't know, I've had 23 minutes, which is enough for me. We firmly believe in the image as liberation and in the liberation of the image. And what I mean by that is that by not willing to forget the crimes of the state, by using the image to liberate people, we cannot separate that by just following the usual processes of film. We have to teach film in the most diverse way possible. We have to teach and talk and make films in the most diverse way possible, because we have to liberate the image. Cinema is just over 100 years old. It's very young. It's still developing, and it's a very exciting language to be involved with, and I'm sure everybody agrees with that. But where is it going? How do we develop that language? What does it become? We have language, we have spoken language, we have plays, we have other forms of language, but cinema is the youngest language, and so it has the most potential, because we all know that it's the youth that have more potential. I don't know what these are. These are just some stills of the films. Other examples of trauma and obstinate memory: Claude Lanzmann, Joshua Oppenheimer, Emad Burkhardt, Ava DuVernay. These are all filmmakers that follow this obstinate memory notion that we're involved with. And coming to the end now, Jean-Luc Godard really believes that cinema is a collective memory. In every country, there's a national cinema. In Vietnam, in across Asia, and in Britain, and everywhere, there's a national cinema. Films mean something. There's obviously an international cinema where you have work which transcends borders, but cinema itself is a new language. And what I mean by that is not in terms of the way I was speaking earlier, in terms of its development, but films play part of our memory, part of history, and films mean things to people. And so the development of this language, I think, is really, really important. Um, we all know that at the moment that peoples across the world are protesting around issues of gender and issues of race and on climate. And I think they are looking now at the lessons of the past. And I think obstinate memory and films which refuse to forget the crimes that have been committed by nation states on its own people and on each other are very important to remember. And also, much more importantly, is how resistance happened. Countries have fought, and there have been victories, and there have been victories within countries. And it's important that people, young people, know about the successful struggles of the past. And that's it.
Great, Ken. Thank you. Thank you so much. To anyone who wants to ask a question, I just say you can put a question by putting up your hand and asking it here, or you can put it in the chat. While you're thinking about what question you might want to ask, I will ask one. Well, I make a comment really. So what you've been saying about memory really interests me. You've made me think about whether or not memory will be reformatted by the appearance of film for the last 100 years, that way of thinking about the image. And so because I was immediately struck by the fact that, you know, the state also has memory and uses memory, but it does it in a slightly different way. Look, if you walk through London, for example, you see all these statues, right? They've got monuments everywhere to memory, right? Remembering these figures and so on. But they're there and they're like high up and sort of unavailable, and there's not much detail about them. And I was thinking, I'm reading Joel McKim's book on architecture, media, and memory, and he talks about a distinction made by Arthur Danto between monuments in memory and memorials. And memorials strike me as being the obvious thing that films do more than monumentalize. Monumentalize is kind of triumphalist and fixes a heroic figure, whereas memorials are really involve the people who are living now with what happened. And it made me think immediately, the thing I thought of then is your film Ultraviolence, right? So I want you to maybe think about this distinction between monumental memory and like a memory that's more like memorials, that engages the people that are mourning now in some kind of remembering, that moves them forward into the present. Does that make sense to you in terms of what Ultraviolence is doing?
Yes, it does. But the ability of film and filmmakers and students who are making films is that we are able to take images which are part of the national memory. So there are always images which mean something in every single country. Whatever the image, it doesn't really matter what it is. But when you take those images and you re-edit them and reformulate it, that is what a filmmaker does. So you're using and you're kind of releasing different memories in a certain pattern. You're saying, look at this and look at this and look at this. So you can take any country, and every country has its memories, has its national memories. The question is, what when they're monumentalized by the state, there has to be a way of destroying that and challenging it. And that's what obstinate memory is about. It's about the memory. It's called obstinate memory because it's about memories that don't want to be remembered. It's about things the state would want to forget. And they would want to forget it for all kinds of reasons. It doesn't really matter. But obstinate memory is something which cannot be forgotten because it exists, it's historical, and it has to go on.
Sylvan wants to ask a question. So, Sylvan, if you could unmute yourself, you could ask. You there?
I think he's typed it.
No, he's got his hand up. So where's the chat? Okay.
Hi, I'm Shravan. I have just written it on the
I see,
chat
yeah.
box, so you can find my question there.
Yeah. Thanks.
Thanks for this illuminating talk. My question is, how do we engage with what you call obstinate memory when those memories have increasingly been turning into nice consumables, like the face of Shay is sweepingly present on t-shirts or beer mugs?
I guess if the face of Che is on beer mugs and t-shirts, I think that's a good thing. That's one thing to say, and I think that's part of the fact that there's a currently in the past 5-10 years there's been increasing interest in young people in what happened in the 60s in leftist movements, and that's something we should encourage. But I understand the point you try to make in terms of how memory and imagery is consumed by capitalism. Capitalism will always consume memory. It will consume everything we produce. It will even consume obstinate memory when it finds it needs it to be able to perpetuate itself. But of course, we have to keep fighting that and finding ways of challenging that. There's no easy solution. It is about perpetually challenging the state. And I'm never satisfied with work that I do, and I'm never satisfied with the reaction of it. It doesn't matter what their reaction is, and that's because I constantly need change for the better. And I think we have to keep this obstinate need for social progress, liberation of the image, and liberation of the people wherever they are. At the core of what we're doing.
We've got a question from Ken Fero.
Okay.
Yeah. Please.
Thank you very much for your interesting presentation with very touching imagery, especially the one from Vietnam. I have one question. As a researcher, we are required to be non-biased. But a researcher are also people with feeling, with political stance. So I would like to know in migrant media, should the filmmaker remain non-biased? Or they can carry with them their feeling, their political stance into their product, or they have to balance between the two? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Well, the first thing I would ask you is that when you say we're required to maintain a balance, I would ask you a question: is required by who?
We have to be biased when we collect the data, when we analyze the data, and when we report the data. But in trauma, in obstinate memory, we with the personal feeling. I think difficult to remain non-biased.
I think that's a very important point. In terms of the question of subjectivity and objectivity, for us, it's very, very clear. You can have an objective methodology, and that's very important because you need to collect the facts and the data. But the presentation of it will always be subjective in its selection, in its focus, in what it's trying to say. And if the academic endeavor or the cultural endeavor is about creating this notion of balance, we completely and utterly reject that because there has been no balance. We are dominated, we are exploited. And so if we're in a situation of domination and exploitation, then we have to make a position against that. When we made the film Injustice, for example, it was 98 minutes long. And within the film, the notion of balance in terms of film is that you have to present one point of view and then you present the other. Within the film, people said, well, you had the voices of the families, but the police were not represented. And there are two responses to that. One, The police are represented in the film through the language of violence. They use violence. But the second most important thing is this. Within the UK, if you've had 38 years of the police point of view in the media, then 98 minutes from the family's point of view is very unbalanced, but not in the way, you know, people would kind of understand it. So I think it's very important that we find the space to be able to challenge the dominant ideology. And of course, the research and methodology has to be objective, but the presentation of the research is always subjective.
Okay, so that means we should have a very objectively method, but in reporting or in analyzing, you can present your feeling or your political stance.
Yes,
okay,
I think
thank you.
We must present it because
you must.
yeah, it's not we can, we must.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you for your question.
Yeah, I want to tell I can't avoid because I know the story, talking about that film a bit more in terms of presentation, because you know, you said that you'd had 38 years, the police had 38 years of telling their story and the family had 98. Well, I was there, and you know this, you could tell this story yourself, I'm sure. At the first screening at the other cinema, where finally the families were to see that story, their version of the story put up on the screen, at the premiere, right? The Police Federation intervened to threaten the cinema with legal suits to stop them from screening it. So it wasn't even possible to present that side of the story, and that film is still banned, I believe, in the UK, even though Channel 4 set up a memo around saying this is the kind of filming they want to support. They haven't supported you. That is a story, right? That you don't get the chance to put every side.
The problem with, I mean, even everybody has heard about George Floyd. Everybody now knows about Black Lives Matter, okay? The film we made 20 years ago in the UK could have prevented some deaths in the UK. Now, we were accused in that film of being too subjective, you know, and too emotional. And in fact, they accused us of lots of other things. But sometimes you need emotion to change a situation. The struggle for liberation in South Africa was not won because people were not emotional. Cuba was not won because people were not emotional. Vietnam did not beat America because people were not emotional. And so in terms of our position on this issue, the state in the UK banned the film 20 years ago. After George Floyd last year, we went back to the television, to Channel 4, and said, okay, the political situation has changed now. People are much more aware of the issue. This is your opportunity to show the film. And Channel 4 once again refused to show the film and said that they will be making their own film with their own perspective. And we know what that will be, bourgeois liberalism, to a sense that they are kind of covering the issue. And so obstinate memory is not something that will easily win. But we all know from the history of mankind that, you know, struggles for justice and struggles for liberation can be won through determination, and we as filmmakers are part of that history.
Great. I didn't know that lovely coda to the story, and just makes me despair more about Channel 4.
Yeah, but it doesn't make me despair, it makes me more angry, which is why I have obstinate memory. It's anger that maintains it. And anger is an emotion that I think we all need, we all have, we all feel it.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Does anyone else have a angry or hopeful or any comment? If not, as we try to keep these to 30 minutes, we've gone a little bit longer.
Yeah.
It's look, 40 minutes is pretty good. I know you've got to get off to something at 10 as well.
Yeah.
Ken, thank you so much for talking.
Thank
to
you.
us, and
Yeah.
hope we're going to hear from you often again soon. And really appreciate everyone who tuned in for this. The next one, folks, is next week, 4 o'clock, and it's Jack Bolton from Belgium, well, England, but he's now based in Belgium, at Leuven University, talking about literature and method in anthropology. Okay, Ken, once again, thank you so much.
Thanks, John, and thanks to everybody at the university for and the other guests for listening to my rambling and ranting.
Good luck with the film, and I hope Ultraviolence will win more awards. It's a terrific film, an important one for people to see.
Thanks, John.
Hopefully we can show it here as well.
Yep.
All right. Thank you very much, everyone. We'll stop
everybody.
recording.
Bye.
And